Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another deck guide, this time for kind of an underplayed budget deck in the format, and that is Maze's End Ramp Combo Control, whatever you want to call it. This is a deck that utilizes the guild gates from the various Ravnica blocks, along with some other printings of gates on the card Maze's End. Maze's End is a card that basically says if you control 10 or more gates whenever you activate its ability, you win the game. This deck is not entirely built around that, but it is a benefit of playing the guild gates in addition to it being a cheaper mana base. The downside of this deck is all the lands, almost all of them, come into play tapped, so you have to find ways to mitigate that. To that end, you use things like Arboreal Grazer, Utopia, or Growth Spiral, and a newer one, Joint Exploration, to put as many lands into play as possible, and then kind of leverage the abilities of those gates from there. You have a lot of gates matter payoffs, things like Gatebreaker Ram, which can be one of the largest creatures in the battlefield, especially for its cheap mana cost. It gets +1/+1 for each gate you control, so easily when this comes down, turn 3, this can easily be a 5/5 or a 6/6 that can have Vigilance and Trample. Another payoff is Gate Colossus, which costs 1 less for each gate you control, and is an 8/8 creature that cannot be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. It also has a recursion ability if your opponent can't exile it. And then Gates Ablaze, kind of your way of recovering from an early onslaught. This card can be very critical against aggressive decks like humans or spirits, etc. And basically does X damage, where X is the number of gates you control. And the rest of the deck is just simply kind of a little bit of interaction or whatever dressing you want to put on it. Things like Spell Pierce for a little bit of early interaction. Crackling Perimeter as an alternative win con that allows you to tap gates to deal 1 damage to each opponent. Escape to the Wilds is additional ramp and refilling in the mid to late game. This version was choosing to run Ugat the Spirit Dragon as an additional sweeper / late game payoff. Then Guild Summit is one of your other Gates Matter cards. Whenever this comes into play, you can tap on any number of gates, draw cards, and then whenever a gate enters the battlefield, you draw a card. All of these very powerful payoffs for the payoff of your deck being a little bit slow and clunky. As far as the mana base, the only notable lands besides, obviously all the dual lands, Plaza of Harmony comes into play untapped. You gain 3 life, and then it can produce any color of a gate you control. And then Thran Portal is a newer one. This card basically allows you to have an untapped land in the early game at the cost of basically being a mana confluence. You name a color, taps for a mana of that color, and then you pay 1 life to activate this ability. Sideboard can vary from build to build. This version going very high on Fry, so good against Greasefang, Spirits, Angels, etc. Broken Bond is a way to blow up artifacts or enchantments while also putting lands into play. Invasion of New Phyrexia is kind of a payoff in kind of the grindier matchups. Putting a bunch of XX white knight token creatures onto the battlefield and having a planeswalker on the back end if you happen to kill it. Haywire Might, in addition to Broken Bond for dealing with artifacts and enchantments. Soul Guide Lantern for any type of graveyard nonsense. Basically, Is It Phoenix and copies of Greasefang. Damping Sphere here for Mono Green and Lotus Field. And Weathered Runestone. Non-land permanents in graveyards and libraries can enter the battlefield. Players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. Once again, heavy emphasis on graveyard hate while also being relevant against cards like Collected Company and such. Another variant that's a little bit older includes the card Expressive Iteration before it was banned. Lists for this deck is very few and far between, as it doesn't put up a lot of results, but it is something that did have a result recently, so I figured we'd bring it up. Once again, really nothing to speak of in the main land base other than a bunch of guild gates, 1 or 2 basics in case your opponent has things like Field of Ruin. Mythos of Nethro is basically a destroy target creature or any permanent, non-land permanent, if you pay the 3 colors of mana into it. Rest of the payoffs, nothing too fancy. Gate Creeper Vine is a way to search for specific gates while putting an O2 blocker down, buy you a little bit of time in addition to Arboreal Grazer. Sideboard, a lot of the same interaction pieces. Putrefy is a different one. A little bit expensive, but it allows you to deal with artifacts or creatures that they can't be regenerated. This version gets to run a copy of Giganta. Deafening Clarion is basically a 5th copy of Gates Ablaze. Tormod's Crypts and Lantern of the Lost, very similar for any type of graveyard nonsense. And Damping Sphere once again for Lotus Field and Mono Green. Final variant we'll be looking at is one that uses Open the Gates to find rather than something like Gatecreeper Vine. This allows you to hit your early land drops. Beyond that, Bring to Light kind of ties this all together, allowing you to find your Gates Ablazes, your Gatebreaker Rams, your Escape to the Wilds, etc. Your one-off copy of Assassin's Trophy, much like in a one-off copy of Mythros of Nithro. 3 copies of Gate Colossus. Basically, you have a bunch of different ways to close out the game, and Bring to Light as another mid to late game payoff. Sideboard, a lot more Bring to Light targets, things like Culling Ritual to deal with a bunch of early permanents out of your opponent's deck, Abrupt Decay to disrupt your opponent's early aggression. Fatal Push, once again, helps deal with early creature rushes, Necromentia for any type of combo nonsense, whether it be Lotus Field combo, creativity, etc. Rest in Peace for any type of graveyard nonsense, Extinction Event when you need another sweeper in addition to Gates Ablaze, and then 2 copies of Damping Sphere. So what are the strengths of this deck? What are its weaknesses? Basically, this is a slow, clunky mid-range deck, much like something like Omnath to Light, or maybe something like the Fires decks. The payoffs may not be quite as stark, but you do have this inevitability with Maze's End that some of those decks just simply do not. If you can, all their permanents can be answered. And lands are one of the more difficult things to interact with in the format, as there isn't a ton of playable land destruction. There isn't anything like Blood Moon in the format, so having that kind of an inevitability is quite nice. This deck kind of maybe preys on something like Rakdos if Rakdos doesn't have their early aggression starts. But, the downside, this deck does get overpowered by things like Mono Green, as it doesn't have any easy way to stop a deck like that. A little bit slower to the ground, so aggressive decks can kind of run it over. It doesn't have a early Gates Ablaze or one of its sweepers out of the sideboard. So this deck is a lot of fun to play in small bursts, but may not be the most competitive deck, but it's certainly one of those mid-range decks that is very, very cheap to build. The deck itself is usually about under $100 in paper, and online can be anywhere from 10 to 20 tickets. So it is one of the cheaper entry points in the format, especially if you like the powerful mid-range control decks that typically run hundreds and hundreds of dollars or hundreds and hundreds of tickets. So certainly a deck you should be aware of. We'll try to do a little bit of gameplay with it here soon. But this isn't a deck that's going to break the format or anything, but something you should be aware of. You might see somebody playing it in F&M or something. So if you like this kind of Pioneer content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.